welcome to the Tradewaiters, everybody. We are recording this both in video and audio form. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, it sounds a little different. That's why. And if you're seeing this in video, you might not know we have a podcast called the Tradewaiters, where it's like a book club, but for comics, and it's all on the internet, so you can't actually interact with us. We're doing this for VanCAF 20, what year is it even? I've forgotten.
2020.
Yeah, okay.
What year is it?
I know it feels like several years went by, but it is still 2020.
Okay. So the topic of our episode today is how to get the most out of your comics, how to read deeply. So this is something that's come up basically every episode we've done with the Tradewaiters is sort of delving into like what is a book trying to accomplish, how well is it accomplishing that, what do we, the readers, get out of it, how does it fit into the context of it, the conditions it was made in, or into the conditions we're reading it in. So I guess this is comics as literature, because that's part of the point, at least part of the point why I want to be in a book club is because it's fun to sort of do this thing with books and sort of explore with other people, like what is this book? What is it doing? But maybe we should introduce ourselves first. Our only character building question today is going to be the books you're picking as your example. So tell us who you are and where we can find you on the internet and what books you picked. Okay, so who wants to start?
I can start. Okay, so my name is Jam. Great to see you all. You can find my work at wastedtalent.ca and patreon.com/jam. The two books that I chose to bring back for examples of how to read deeply. The first is the Scott Pilgrim series, which we covered in Tradewaiters episode 37, 8, and 9. So 37, 38, and 39 was our Scott Pilgrimage. And I've also selected Brian Lee O'Malley's follow-up, not related, but next graphic novel called Seconds, and that was Tradewaiters #1.
Right on. That takes me back, Tradewaiters #1. I am Jeff Ellis, and you can find my work at jeffreyellis.ca. And I chose two books that I ultimately felt had a lot of parallels. And so part of the reading deeply was my own discovery of how these two works kind of reflected and contrasted each other. So my first book was what I feel is one of our most controversial episodes, which was V for Vendetta by Alan Moore. And then my second choice was actually one of our two-part episodes where we did the series of Berlin by Jason Lutz. So here's all 3 volumes, which was later collected into a nice hardcover. And I think this was actually where I feel like we had one of our best discussions of a book. So I think both episodes we had a lot to say. And I think looking back on these and the questions, I found a lot of connection between the two works that I'm interested to talk about today.
Okay, I'm Jonathan. You can find my work at phobos-comic.com. And the books I picked Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind by Hayao Miyazaki, which I believe is still our most listened to episode. We did 2 episodes on this series because it's pretty long. It might, I think, have been the first manga series that we did an episode on. I'm not entirely sure about that, but
We didn't do Astro Boy before that?
I can't remember. I'm not sure. You might be right.
I think we did Astro Boy first.
Okay. It was one of the early ones anyways. And So this is, I have several volumes of this. It's pretty long. And the other book I picked is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which is another well listened to episode. I think both of those books are books that a lot of people have read, and maybe that's why they're episodes that listeners have gravitated to. So they're very different books, but I think that's going to maybe be some interesting discussions. All right, so I have a list of questions, and we're going to go through these as sort of to frame different ways to think about the comics that you're reading. So the first question is maybe the deepest one, which is, what is the goal of the work? So as a reader, you can never really be sure, you can never know for sure what the intent of the author was, but often they leave plenty of clues, and often they kind of want you to understand what their purpose was. So this is kind of where the conversation happens between author and reader, and is, for me at least, one of the most interesting parts of reading a comic or any other kind of storytelling medium.
I agree. I think this is one of the most interesting questions when you're starting to really read a comic more deeply. Because in making that guess, you can see how the decisions of the author either support or detract from that goal. And as you mentioned, like anything that we decide is the goal is just a guess. And some goals are more tangible than others. Sometimes an author just wants to make a comic.
Yeah, I would say that as we're all authors as well, we all make our own comics. And as an author, I don't necessarily ever have like a one sentence summary that I could say, this is the purpose of my story. If I could sum it up in a sentence, I wouldn't need to write the story. So I feel like I'm probably not unique in that. I feel like a lot of other authors maybe feel similarly, that you, part of writing the story is figuring out your thesis or your theme, but then it's the job of the reader to decode it and try to understand it.
I think that segues well into my example, so maybe if I could pick up there. So one of the comics that I chose was Scott Pilgrim, and I think that this is a good example of a story where an author maybe had a less cohesive purpose going into it, but found that purpose and tried to reinforce it as the series continued. If I were to guess Brian Lee O'Malley's intention, I think that he mostly wanted to give a feeling more than convey a specific message. He really wanted to bring this atmosphere of, you know, adolescence, if you want to call that, the age of your early 20s, with a lot of video game. To me, he really wanted to capture the feeling of being a hero in a video game and imagining yourself as a hero in a video game. But actually, as the series went on, to me, the goal of it is to explain, you know, struggling through adulthood, especially through the lens of relationships.
Okay, so I've got, of my two examples, one of them, I think the theme is a little easier to suss out than the other. I think with Nausicaa, it's more sort of an epic fantasy. It's a high contrast world with like armies fighting each other and supernatural phenomena. And so it's easier to kind of see the where my understanding of the theme, at any rate, is that it's sort of a response to, like a lot of Japanese stories from like mid 20th century, it's sort of dealing with the trauma of World War II, where you've got these locked in what they think of as an inevitable conflict, but in reality it's futile and should never have happened in the first place. And you've got environmental catastrophes that result from this war, and it's sort of this quest for peace. Like, what is peace? How do you get there? How does peace relate to the natural world, not just these different armies? and we have a protagonist who sort of can embody that sensibility. It takes her a while to get to that, but she's sort of our lead into like how things can be better. Whereas with Persepolis, it's a little harder to figure out exactly the purpose of the story. I mean, both write more autobio than I ever have, but I feel like autobio especially, like you don't necessarily have like a single message you want to convey so much as just you want to tell people about your life, maybe. And so she definitely accomplishes that. Like you feel like you know a lot more about Marjane after reading the story. And it's also kind of a window into a culture that people outside of Iran or who didn't live through the Iranian Revolution wouldn't know anything about. So I feel like that's also part of the purpose and maybe part of why it's become such a popular work, is because it's this window into this world that the rest of us aren't familiar with. But it's also not necessarily like singularly representative of all Iranian experience. It's focused very strongly just on the one author and her life.
All right.
Sorry, just to reemphasize that in autobio and in memoir, quite often, if you want to provide a window into a certain experience by really delving into the details, you can make that experience a lot more human and relatable.
All right. And then like, I guess, yeah, speaking of human and relatable, I was looking at both these works, V for Vendetta and Berlin, and I found that I think both of them deal with the rise of a fascist government. In the case of V for Vendetta, it's a sort of a fantasy science fiction sort of dystopian future, and looking at sort of a well-established regime that's like several years into their agenda, versus Berlin, which is like looking at the beginnings of the rise of National Socialism in Germany. And I think that both works examine it through the perspective of the individual people and how it affects them. And, you know, you see the effects of this fascist society through the individual characters, both in V for Vendetta and in Berlin. And I think that it's the approach to those characters and maybe how it deals with the negative consequences of fascism is where the two books really diverge. And when we get into the success of the author's intent, I think I'll have more to say on that. But I think one thing from my research is I feel like definitely with Alan Moore's work, V for Vendetta was written with the intent of being a protest against the Thatcher government, and specifically a response to a lot of anti-LGBTQ legislation that was put into place. And so I think the author intent was to create an assaultive work that was attacking a government. And I think with Jason Lutz, it's more of a meditative reflection, sort of the National Socialism Party has risen and fallen, and now we're looking back and kind of examining how did we get here? How did this happen? And so I think that with Berlin, it's kind of examining the root causes of how did this happen, where I think V for Vendetta is more of a like, what would we have to do to end this? Like if we were in the middle of it, what would have to happen? So it's a little more speculative.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to compare those two works in particular with their themes, because one is looking to the past and using real events from history. And the characters in the story aren't necessarily historical characters, but the things that happen are historical. So it's sort of our window into this series of events that most people have a general understanding of. Like we know about World War II, we know about Hitler and Nazi Germany. So it doesn't need to put as much sort of it doesn't need to convince these are bad things. Like it doesn't take it upon itself as its goal, because it's assuming you already are in agreement with that, and it's more sort of coldly laying out like here's how this happened. Whereas V for Vendetta, like I think the context matters a lot, where it's written in the 1980s, and maybe it was harder to convince people that something like that could happen again in Britain, even though there was like a big shift to the right happening while this was being written.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that that's where the two works really differ a lot, is just in like kind of I feel like in a lot of ways V for Vendetta was almost meant as like a call to action. Like you were supposed to finish reading it and be so upset by what you read that you would go to like get involved, be more political, get more active, because you wouldn't want to be in that dystopian future. And then I would say, yeah, Berlin is more just like, yeah, kind of
Watch
like
out.
meditating on it.
Yeah. Okay, that was good discussion. I'm sure those things are going to come up, like the idea of theme is going to come up with some of these other questions as well. But we got to stick to our schedule here, or we're not going to get through them all. So next is about the author's choices. So when authors create a work, and because we're talking about comics, I think all of our examples have a single cartoonist. Yeah, they do. Oh no, Vendetta is the exception.
V is a team. Yeah.
Yeah, but all the other ones are a single person doing the writing and drawing. But whether it's a team or a single person, you make choices as a writer and as an artist, and those will inform the story. They'll inform the theme, and sometimes it works better than others. I think it works pretty well with the picks that we've picked as our examples, but certainly this is an area where if you're a cartoonist, this is something that you want to think about, is does my drawing style fit my my motivation for doing this story in the first place? Let's see. So with Persepolis, I think both of my examples, the choices in the art suit the goal pretty well. Like Persepolis is autobio, and I think because it's a real world setting with characters who are real people, I think it's beneficial to kind of simplify and cartoon them into like more simply drawn characters, because they're more relatable. That's the masking effect that Scott McCloud talks about in his book, where a character that's drawn more simply is easier for the reader to connect to. And because drawing all her characters that way, you can kind of see yourself in any of the characters. And because it's a real world setting, even if you're not very familiar with Iran, you know what 20th century life looks like generally. So you don't need cars and houses to be drawn in like a high level of detail, because you know what these things look like. So it makes the story more engaging without leaving out any information that you're going to need. And then with Nausicaa, Miyazaki's an animator, so he could choose any drawing style he wanted to. And the style of the art does look different from the style in his movies, partly for practical reasons, because you wouldn't want to animate all that cross-hatching. But I think the cross-hatching that he's added to this that he wouldn't necessarily have had in other stories helps with kind of the grittiness of it, and with the sort of the sense of a long space of time. Like it feels a little more nostalgic to have all these ink lines everywhere. It looks like an etching from 100 years ago. And that suits the work, I think, because it makes you feel like things are old, even stories set in the future.
Yeah, it's true. And it's really interesting to think about how the choices you make as an artist can either serve or detract from the goal. I think the two examples that I picked are a good window into how a more experienced writer handles this versus a less experienced writer. So Brian Lee O'Malley had only written, I think, 1 or 2 books before he started the Scott Pilgrim series. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the goal of the work was not as clear, it was not as cohesive, and it developed going forward. And so for that reason, I think some of the choices in that book detracted from the theme. So the video game iconography, you know, Scott was really held up as a hero, but the things that he were doing were actually not that great. And there were times when the other characters in the work were more aware than, you know, Scott seemed to be. But and you know, as you follow the course of the entire arc of the books, it doesn't really land. The theme of the work doesn't really land in a way that's really punchy. And so if you compare that with the book that followed, Seconds, that's a book that had a very cohesive theme. It was of exploring regret. And it took this idea of like navigating adult relationships, but a little bit farther down the line with more adulthood responsibilities. And the whole plot reinforced that theme. So the plot was a character appears that gives the protagonist, Katie, the ability to have a do-over in her life. And Katie abuses this power and it spirals out of control in her life. And so the narrative choices are the scenes that progress throughout the book are selected a lot more cohesively in order to reinforce that theme of regret and responsibility and consequences. Whereas Scott Pilgrim was just like, a lot of fun stuff happened.
Yeah, I know. I think you're right. Seconds is a much tighter plot for sure, and maybe more enjoyable as a read for that reason. Like, I don't necessarily think the story needs to have a really tight plot, but in Brian Lee O'Malley's case, it suited Seconds very well, and maybe Pilgrim could have benefited from a little bit of that.
Okay. That's great. Should I jump in with mine or? All right. So yeah, I think as far as like success of the artist, I think that as far as the art goes, I feel like David Lloyd did a fantastic job of realizing the script that he was provided. There's like a really gritty, heavy kind of art style that's drawn in V for Vendetta, and I think it suits the really gritty, heavy subject matter. I think the original work was in black and white, and the colors were added when it was published by DC, which is something I think we talked about in the episode. And then, you know, comparing that to Berlin, which was intended to be black and white, I feel like ultimately, like, black and white suits this kind of subject matter better. I think I've heard like an argument that like black and white art makes you think more about the content and not react as emotionally to the content. That color is like an emotional indicator, where black and white, you're more intellectually absorbing it. And so I feel like Berlin benefited from being black and white. And I think that V for Vendetta actually would have been a clear, maybe like would have been better as a story if it was black and white. I think the starkness of the black and white would have suited the mood. And actually, I think we had talked about how some of the coloring actually got in the way of reading some of the art, because the art hadn't been intended to be read in color. So I think that this is, I think that one note for V for Vendetta might be to do it black and white. But I think that in both cases, the illustrator did a really good job. I think that when we talk in terms of the writing, this is where I had some interesting thoughts, because I think that my initial premise if when I came into the original episode of V for Vendetta is I would have said Alan Moore was successful in his intentions, which is that he wanted to sort of create a call to action in a comic form, that it was celebrating anarchy and proposing this idea of toppling the government in kind of in a really aggressive way. And I think from reading Berlin, I feel like I see that, I think there's a very different approach happening there in the writing, but I feel like in some ways it's a lot more successful, because I think that in both works, we're examining fascism through different perspectives. Like, I think in both works, you're looking at people that are benefiting from the system and people that are being oppressed by the system. But I would say that the like emotional impacts, the trauma that's being inflicted on the characters is definitely dealt with in a more maybe like a more realistic way, or just like a more sensitive way in Berlin, where I feel like there's some really unpleasant things that are happening in Berlin, but I think that the way it's approached, it's not as jarring, not as like punch in the face as V for Vendetta, where I feel like V for Vendetta was made for shock value. The intention of the artist, I think, was to essentially punch the reader in the face. And I think for that reason, not everyone's going to enjoy being punched in the face, where you're going to lose a lot of readers that way. And I think that Berlin is able to sort of deliver similar ideas, but in a more nuanced way that's going to, I think, appeal to a broader audience. And so I think more people are going to feel that masking effect you were talking about, Jonathan, where they're going to actually see themselves in the work, where I think that maybe from my position in society, I can read V for Vendetta and say, oh, isn't that horrible? I really need to do something. But I think that if you're someone who's already daily being victimized by a system, you're going to look at V for Vendetta and just say, yeah, I welcome to the party. Like, I don't need to live this again. Like, I don't care. And so maybe Berlin does a better job of kind of speaking from different perspectives, was kind of my takeaway.
If I can echo that, like, one of the things that really struck me about Berlin is how carefully all the characters were selected. So like all of the characters were deliberately selected to show through different lenses how fascism was progressing in Berlin. Comparing that to Persepolis, where, Marjane decided to show her own perspective because it was real and deeply humanizing. But for that reason, we didn't get a lot of different perspectives of what was happening in Iran. And we perhaps don't have a complete picture of that event, although we can never have a perfect picture of a historical event.
Yeah, I think when you bring up the audience for V for Vendetta, I think that's important to understand the story as well. Moore's perception of who would be reading this book was maybe pretty narrow, especially if you consider that when it was originally published, it wasn't this big graphic novel on the shelf of every bookstore with a movie adaptation to promote it. It was a very small indie publication in Britain with not a lot of readers. And so I think he was speaking just to that very narrow. And so there probably were still people who were kind of like, oh, that's not for me. I'll just read some other story in this anthology or whatever it was. Yeah, I think the part of the reason that V for Vendetta is less effective now is because so many more people reading comics and so many more people read this particular comic and then realizing, oh, wait, this doesn't do what I want it to. So that's part of the historical content. I think that's worth keeping in mind when we're looking at a book. Like even if it's a book from pretty recently, like I was checking the date on Persepolis, and the first volume was published in French in 2000. So this is like right before the World Trade Center, when certainly a lot of English, at least, had some very particular ideas about the Middle East that this book can be beneficial for having a different perspective, but also that's not context that the book was necessarily written in. It just happens to still work in that new context. Okay, so maybe let's jump ahead to our next question here. So the next question I've got is, how does this work fit into the author's larger body of work? And Jam has already kind of brought this up a little bit, so
Yeah.
maybe you can start with that.
Yeah, sure. Mine is pretty quick and easy to understand. So there was Lost at Sea and like a couple of other smaller works. And then the behemoth that is Scott Pilgrim happened. It was a phenom, and it really transformed comics and transformed Brian Lee O'Malley's career. And then seconds came out in the aftermath of that. So it's funny because there's so much pressure on an author after they make a smash success. Brian had so much more experience, and he also had like a lot more resource and time. Like everyone was willing to give him anything he needed to make his next work. And so whereas like Scott Pilgrim was like a young scrappy indie comic, I think originally published by like Slave Labor Graphics or something, or his Oni. So pretty different, but a nice continuum that you can see Brian Lee O'Malley's experience evolving throughout.
Okay. Well, as far as the how the work fits into the larger body of work for the works I picked, I would say I think that with Jason Lutz, I've almost read his entire body of work because he's primarily he did a small graphic novel called Jar of Fools, and then he followed that up with Berlin, and he's done a few short stories, and he's written some things that other people have drawn. But as far as like his own written and drawn works, I've read them all. And so I would say that it's interesting to me that his first book, Jar of Fools, deals with magicians. It deals with like struggling magicians they're kind of at the end of the heyday of when people went to magic shows. So they're sort of hobo magicians, and they take this young boy, I think, or girl, I forget, a young child into their circle. And this is an aspiring magician, and sort of talks all about Harry Houdini and that great era of magic. And I found it interesting that in Berlin, there's a character who's obsessed with Houdini. So there is this sort of through line in the two works. And it's both dealing with like history and also a similar time period of history. So, I would say Jason Lutz seems to be very on brand in all of his works. And then now I don't know all of David Lloyd's drawing work, but I do know as an author, Alan Moore, I'm very familiar with his works, and he is very on brand with V for Vendetta. I would say that it very much fits in with his oeuvre of work. There's a lot of repeated themes in his work, which is like anti-government, anarchy, mysticism, and shamanism. Which even in V for Vendetta, the detective taking acid in order to catch V, going on this shamanic quest, like all of this is stuff that you just see repeated over and over again in Swamp Thing and Watchmen and all of his other works. So yeah, I think both authors have a very sort of set style that they're definitely working within in both works.
So for both of those that I picked, I didn't think about this when I was picking them, but they are both books that have been done by people who are also work in film. So Marjane has other graphic novels that she's done. I have not actually read any of them, so I don't know as much about the context of her other work in that sense. But she was also heavily involved in the animated version of Persepolis. And because you've got the same person who did the graphic novel who's doing the animated adaptation of it, the consistency in the style, both of the story and of the art, is like, there's a lot of consistency there, which is great to see, because then you feel like you're still seeing the voice of the artist in both works. It's not one artist doing a work and then some totally other person doing their version of it. It's pretty distant in that sense. And then for Miyazaki, his context is interesting in that Nausicaa was originally going to be an animated movie, but no studio would pick it up if there wasn't a manga of it to start with. This was in the early days of Studio Ghibli when he couldn't just do a movie, do any movie he wanted to. He hadn't sort of proven himself to the industry. So he went and did this amazing graphic novel just so he could make a movie, and then we never get any more graphic novels from him, which is kind of too bad because like, but I mean, then there's all these movies he got to make too, so that's also good, I guess. So when we're talking about authors, I think it's also good to bring up the idea of the death of the author, which is something you hear about a lot when people talk about literature. The idea being that once an author has finished their work, that they no longer have any control over it, and it's all up to the reader to decide what it means. And I think that there's definitely a lot of validity to that, but I don't think you can also then completely ignore who the author was and what their intent was. Like it's a way of thinking of things. I don't think it's like an absolute law of the universe that the author has no control over their work once it's finished. I don't know if the rest of you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would say, yeah, that's a deep that's a deep topic. But I mean, I would say that certainly from what I've read of Alan Moore, I would say he would 100% agree with the idea of the death of the author. I think he would probably tell you that all of his ideas are living on in the immateria of the undermined that we can all tap into, and like they'll exist on their own and have lives of their own independent of him and the rest of us, all while renouncing all royalty checks for the films being adapted from his work. So yeah, I mean, I think that definitely in terms of how things fit into the the context of the time, I would say Alan Moore's work was like fit into that grim and gritty, angry late 80s, early 90s time period. And in many ways, V is the prototype for all of the murderous superheroes that emerged in the late 90s. Like V was one of the first.
Huh? Yeah.
Yeah. Before the Punisher, there was V. And for better or for worse, I think that influenced a whole generation of cartoonists in how you seek justice. You seek justice with knives, like, and I think that yeah. I mean, I think if you look at Alan Moore's later works, you look at his ABC Comics. I would actually say, in many ways, that was his apology letter to comics, where he was like, "I am going to write really happy, fun stories that have superheroes that do wondrous things, because I feel really guilty about being responsible for every superhero like murdering people continuously." But yeah, I have more to say about Alan Moore here than Jason Lutz. I'm not as I mean, I think Jason Lutz is a fantastic cartoonist. I think he embodies a lot of really amazing graphic novel work that we're seeing in the year 2000 and beyond. But I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, Jason Lutz is in a very established tradition of graphic novel making, where I would say, for better or for worse, I would say Alan Moore has the benefit of being first. He was the one who kind of took this stuff and was like, what if comics were unpleasant? What if things were grim and gritty? And like, people were like, hey, that's cool. Let's do that for a bit, you know? So like, yeah, whether you like it or not, he innovated it.
Yeah. Similarly, I think Scott Pilgrim fits in the same kind of genre, right? So like, when you read Scott Pilgrim now, and we spent quite a bit of time talking about this on the Tradewaiters, the things that happen and the way that the story goes, it doesn't seem that groundbreaking, but actually because of the time that it came out, it is a trope establishing landmark work in comics. It was one of the first to bring what I would call like the anime rebound style to indie. So an artist who was very heavily influenced by anime artwork, but then bending it into a more independent style. And this style almost became like a house style for independent comics for a little while, you know, like it became like the Scott Pilgrim look that a lot of people emulated. Further to that, like the use of video game imagery and video game tropes, so merging video game tropes and comic tropes in one was groundbreaking when Scott Pilgrim did it. And now it's a very easy way to communicate. It's like the dam was broken and now you can pull tropes from anywhere. The other thing that I think Brian Lee O'Malley did really well is pioneering what I would call like the narrator meta, where like you have a character and he's like, I hope that this works out well for me. And the narrator comes in and is like, it didn't. And that's something that I think was done a lot in Scott Pilgrim, but I hadn't seen it many other places. And that kind of became a signature of O'Malley's. So again, like he started Scott Pilgrim as a relative unknown. It became a phenom, and then Seconds followed up with it. And he already had, you know, this gilded reputation, but Seconds didn't really make as much of a splash. There wasn't anything groundbreaking in Seconds like there was in Scott Pilgrim. It's a more cohesive work, it's a more mature work, it's you know, a much more polished work, but it didn't make as much of an impact because of the context of its time.
Yeah, I think like when we did our episode, this came up with some of our younger trade waiters, how I'm thinking of Jess in particular, who wasn't a fan of the book. And I think part of that is the context. If most of the stuff you've read is post Scott Pilgrim, then kind of the innovative work that the book was doing has kind of spread out, and like lots of other cartoonists are doing it. And so it's easier, I think, to reject the story for its many flaws, and it has many flaws, and say, oh, well, I don't get it. It doesn't do anything for me. Like I could get I could get the good things about this somewhere else without all the things I don't like about it. But that's where sort of the context is important, where and the rest of the trade waiters, we all sort of read it when it was new, and so we experienced this process firsthand. So our contexts are different. This is where the death of the author is real, where like we're all experiencing this story differently because of our own personal contexts. But yeah, even if it's not a book, like even if it's V for Vendetta and you decide, no, I don't really like this, it's still worthwhile to be able to sort of step back and look at like, what did this accomplish in its context compared to the comics that came before and the comics that came after. And that doesn't necessarily make you like a book better, but it is interesting. It gives you a broader understanding of the world.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, yeah, I think that is, it kind of connects back to that sort of what I was saying before about being first, where like, you know, in 1987, comics were just for kids, and there was nothing significant written in a comic. And so when Watchmen comes out, people are like, oh, it's literature. And there's nothing to compare it to. And so now in 2020, we have all of this work we can go through. Now we can look back and go like, well, like Watchmen did some stuff, but is it the best thing? Like maybe there's some other works that have more nuance. Like, oh, we have V for Vendetta, and that is challenging fascism. At the time, it was the only thing challenging fascism, but now we have all these other options to choose from. Now we could read Berlin instead. And so it's like, yeah, when there's nothing for comparison, you can sort of be elevated onto a pedestal. And then later, 20 years down the road, suddenly it's like, well, actually, these other authors have handled this topic actually much better now. And there's much better examples that have been created. But sometimes these things get remembered because they were first, because they were the innovator, right?
Yeah, and we've talked some on Tradewaiters before about how